Madam Secretary, nice to see you again. I think it's a record, 3 times before our committee in 1 year, and I'm delighted to have you here. Senate Bill 441, first off. I've just taken a kind of a cursory look at the language. I guess what I would like to know from you is really kind of your interpretation of just how it would actually work, in reality. You can read the text of the bill, but where are we missing? And I just from my own experience, I think that am I correct in that the election monitors, for example, in Bridgeport, they have a very limited access to things. Is that part of the reason for this particular bill?
It's actually, thank you, good question. It's actually the opposite. The election monitors have a lot of authority, but it's authority we would not typically have had in our office. So, for example, little things we noticed, staff maybe could have used more training, or, best practices have evolved over time that an election worker may not have been utilizing. Little things like the font on a form or the explanation on a form. A lot of these things are things we would not have the jurisdiction to compel a local election worker, because they're elected in their own right, to actually do, unless the law is being broken. So there's a huge gray area that falls from the most simplistic, take 1 hour of training, take a refresher course. This is the way this process is intended to work, all the way up to what we saw with the election monitors in Bridgeport, which was someone installed in the office of the town clerk during all hours of operation. The bill as written, we suggested a few changes, but essentially it would work. An independent board of volunteers, 17 members are contemplated here. Referrals made from ROVAC, town clerks, COST, CCM, our office, SEEK, and then the legislature. And towns, SEEK, our office, individuals would make referrals, much like we see with the SEEK process now. And this board, and I'm going to oversimplify, but in short, this board would review the information and either dismiss the referral or refer it to a tier. Tier 1 is meant to be mainly, like, I would just say very simple changes. Like, a good example, I received a call once about a registrar's office not being open at a time that a resident thought it was open. And it was just a matter of them having a note on the door, which they hadn't thought to do. Something like that, very simple. The middle tier would be slightly more complicated, more training, perhaps having our office review some paperwork they have to complete, etc. And then the final tier, again, would be, serious malfeasance, but perhaps we're still waiting on a SEEK investigation, or like we saw with our election monitors, things that hadn't been contemplated by the judge needed some intervention. So the third tier would be more hands-on.
Understood. Through you, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for that information, Madam Secretary. Just listening to you, a few things came to mind. First and foremost, you mentioned like the election monitors were installed in the office, and I guess your interpretation of that is that's a kind of an aggressive way to address the issues versus going through this tiered process that you just described that is laid out in Senate Bill 441, and I can understand that too. I guess my question really has to do with like the real world effect or impact of what they can do, because for me the election monitors were not able to do what I wanted them to do, which was to be outside of the office understanding what is going on as far as the absentee ballot process and the potential for any type of ballot fraud or for absentees and the harvesting issues that I think Bridgeport brought to light. So my understanding about this process is it's not going to do that either. But what it might do is create more of a structured way to oversee a municipality that maybe is not up to snuff as far as their best practices in running an election. Am I right in that interpretation?
No, I think it could, right? If I had unlimited resources, or if the election monitor bill had provided additional resources, right? I could have hired 10 people to walk around and go to every building and hand out information flyers and be on the radio and on television telling people, don't do this. You know, there are so many things that could be done, but, you know, time and money are finite. So in the statute that did pass, we were able to have an election monitor. I interpreted that into we could have multiple monitors so that the office was always under observation, which had not been done in the prior years when an election monitor was appointed. So I think within this tier system, tier 3 could be, the mitigation is to go to public housing buildings or senior housing buildings. The mitigation, to me, or I think this is designed to be suitable to address whatever the concern is.
Yeah, thank you very much. Through Mr. Chairman, I appreciate those answers. To me, it highlights the problem, which is that you mentioned there's not enough money or resources to go out there and go to every building and provide information. But the fact of the matter is the bad actors that we are trying to capture and catch in the act, that's what they are doing. They're using their resources to go out to various buildings and interact with voters and potentially engage in, a fraudulent election process. And to me, that's the concern. So we keep making these steps to expand the authority and power of government, but we're not going after the problem, in my mind. One of the big issues I have with this bill, and I'm not opposed to it on its face, but I'm looking at it and I'm asking myself, why are certain people included in the Municipal Election Accountability Board? You have the Secretary of State, of course. You have some oversight over elections, I think. Okay. The State Elections Enforcement Commission, that makes sense. But then why do we have representatives of the Treasurer's and Comptroller's office?
So most people don't realize the treasurer, the comptroller, and the secretary in tandem certify elections in our state.
Well, I can understand
so
that they might have a role in the final certification, but any actual on-the-ground knowledge of elections and so forth, I think is lacking there. But the bigger concern for me is that what we're doing is we're putting partisan elected officials in a position to have oversight over what towns are doing as far as their election process. Now, I understand that we have no way around that because that's kind of how the towns do it also. But to take the most significant constitutional officers in the state that are elected, they're partisans by virtue of being in some political party. It raises a red flag for me as a what is the purpose of their role in the ultimate oversight. I'm certain there's no nefarious desire behind it, but the fact of the matter is, I'm certain that every person elected to constitutional office has a preference who they want to see win our, office for governor, for example, or maybe their own election.
Yeah, I don't feel strongly about those two offices. We actually were our desire was to round it out beyond an audience that had such direct ties to our elections. And because they have to actually sign their name to certifying the elections, we thought they might feel they had some skin in the game, and it made sense. And it's not the constitutional officer necessarily. It could be their designee as we envisioned it. So they could name someone, a lawyer from their office, for example, or someone who is used to the MARB, for example. So I don't feel strongly about it, but that was our thinking.
Just a final question on that particular bill, and that is, regarding the resources. You mentioned the lack of resources to be able to, properly equip the election monitors to do everything that I might have wanted to see, and I'm certainly sympathetic to that. What kind of resources are going to be used by this group? I mean, obviously it's going to change based on their need, but is there any thought to how it will be funded?
I don't know. It will require funding. One of our suggestions, I don't think this board, the administration of it, can't fall within our office without additional resources. I don't think most people realize how small our elections division is. We have 12 and a half people. And we have 500 town clerks and registrars who we serve directly, not to mention the political parties and all political candidates. And in a state year like this, we get a lot of calls and questions. And then, of course, the people of Connecticut who also like to hear our input on topics as varied as should Trump be on the ballot to how many days of early voting should happen next. So we don't have the resources to administrate this board, but I would imagine you could get by with probably 3 staff people, like an admin, an attorney, and maybe a director. And then it would depend on how many referrals start coming in.
Understood. Through you, Mr. Chairman, thank you, Madam Secretary. I appreciate that answer. I know I said that was the last question on that, but I guess you opened the door for just a couple of other things, which is that I guess I don't know if you and I are on the same page on this. For me, the Bridgeport issue brought to light the potential of absentee ballot fraud. To me, that's pretty straightforward. What we saw with the Dropbox and the video and all this kind of prima facie, we have problems with that process. And nothing that I've seen in this bill is necessarily going to address that. I mean, would it be your argument that, that what happened in Bridgeport is a result of the failure of the election workers in the city of Bridgeport, or is it a result of the policy that we have regarding absentee ballots that opens the door for that kind of activity? Because that's the way I see it. I mean, I can't speak to how well any of those folks necessarily did their job, but I know that election workers across the state, I think, are pretty responsible people. I know how hard they work, certainly in my community. So I certainly don't think that they necessarily need any state oversight to solve problems. But at the same time, I would much rather take the resources that you're referring to and maybe give them to your office or SEC from an investigative standpoint, to say, we need real people on the ground to prevent ballot harvesting. What's your reaction?
As much as I would love to take that money, Senator, what I've learned in this year plus is that there are more issues that are not as impactful in the news headlines, right? There are little things in the process that can be fixed fairly simply and make our system stronger and better for all voters, not just voters in one city. So that is my charge as Secretary of the State, to make sure our process is as efficient and effective as possible. So in terms of the video footage in Bridgeport last year, I'm not sure that there is one cause and effect. I think there are a few different pockets. And I try to remind people there's a difference between voter disenfranchisement and someone who may be breaking the law. As I've reported many times, one of the things our election monitors did was conduct spot check calls to people who had applied for absentee ballots to make sure that they actually applied for absentee ballots, etc. And we made, I believe it's 4 referrals, maybe 5, where we talked to someone who's like, yes, I love to vote, I support voting, I'm gonna vote in this redo. I got my absentee ballot, I filled it out, and I gave it to the nice lady to drop off for me. Now that voter voted as she intended to. She did not feel disenfranchised. She just wasn't aware that there are specific categories of people who are allowed to return an absentee ballot. So we have to be careful when we are interfering in a process that we are not creating more barriers to legitimate voters to offset a few bad actors. So there are some things in the various bills that I think many of our suggestions came as a direct result of being on the ground in Bridgeport for several months every day. A lot of those things are not headline getting, they're not sexy, but they're very boring administrative things. We also have one of the loopholes, for example, Dropbox footage. We wouldn't even have had that court case without the Dropbox footage, but there was no requirement to keep that, to retain that footage for any period of time, or to have it available for public consumption, or even to have a Dropbox camera. So those suggestions were made as a result of being on the ground in Bridgeport. Another, like, no one knows about the ED3A form, but that is a form that allows a voter to request an additional absentee ballot when their first one is ruined. So imagine I'm sitting here, my ballot, I spill water on it, I can't use it anymore, a coffee, whatever. And there was no limitation barring circulators from taking out additional absentee ballots, saying that they are doing so for the voter who had one spoiled. And sometimes that's legitimate, but I thought it was a loophole. So one of our suggestions was you can't take out multiple ED3A ballots. So there are quite a few things sprinkled throughout the bills that are a direct result. The absentee ballot application window, the fact that absentee ballot applications can only be used in 1 year and not carried over. And, you know, we have had this conversation, and I have said this to anyone who will listen often. And appropriations knows I have requested funding because I do think that right now most information gets to voters by political parties and political candidates. And I believe the state, who is a neutral party despite being elected, should be responsible for that communication and that circulation. Where we disagree maybe is who should pay for it.
Through Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, Madam Secretary. I appreciate you getting into kind of the meat of the election integrity items that are in 5498 predominantly. So I guess we can talk about that to a degree. You know, I appreciated everything you said, and you know, looking at the bill that's before us, you know, some of the items that are contained therein are definitely moves in a positive direction. Can I ask you, I mean, since you and I have had this conversation twice now about you bringing us certain types of policies for us to digest and potentially debate and vote on here in this committee, is this bill a product of your suggestions, or is this you're simply testifying a bill drafted by the chairs of the committee? I'm curious to know what ended up in this bill based on your input.
Don't quiz me on the sections. Much of it is based on suggestions we had. I'm sure other legislators submitted ideas for the committee to formulate and put together. A lot of the technical fixes I know came from our office. Some might look familiar from years past. And certainly some of the things I mentioned, like the ED 3A form, et cetera, came from us.
Yeah. So, through you, Mr. Chairman, are you satisfied with what's in the bill? Do you think this is going far enough to address the issue of Bridgeport and potentially where that might be happening elsewhere?
I'm definitely satisfied outside of, some of the comments I have in our written testimony. I think every system needs tweaking, right? And sometimes it is better to err on the side of solving. I hesitate on how to phrase this. We are at risk, I think, of overcorrecting and disenfranchising the vast majority of voters based on a few bad actors. And I can only qualify that based, I'm not a judge, I'm not an investigator, so I can only qualify that based on what has been reported to me. This is where 441, I think, is a tremendously helpful bill because you don't risk broader disenfranchisement. And if you have a real issue in one municipality, you would then have the opportunity to insert the force that you need in that one locality without, making Canterbury do the same.
Understood. Through you, Mr. Chairman. So, Madam Secretary, I mean, you used a lot of different language, that I've been writing down key words, not just pockets either, which I thought was interesting. Pockets. Barriers, tweaking. You just said overcorrection. I certainly am sympathetic to those ideas, except I would disagree. I don't think we're anywhere near the point of overcorrecting. In fact, I don't think we're addressing the problem at all. I don't see how creating please, folks, we don't.
Yeah, sorry. Just for everyone, there are no demonstrations or speaking out of turn allowed in committee hearings in the General Assembly. Thank you very much, and please continue, Mr. Ranking Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, no, and again, I mean, my duty here is to ask you questions, not to debate you. But I mean, forgive me for pushing back a little. I know that we've had this. You and I have been debating this issue since you were sitting on the committee, and numerous times since. The concern is, potentially depriving someone of the value of their vote, and for me, every tiny bit of potential election fraud is also impacting the validity of everyone else's vote. I don't know the extent of what happened beyond what we saw in Bridgeport. I don't think anybody knows. But I can tell you, and I can certainly speculate, that the system is the problem. And that system exists statewide. We just happen to become aware of it, as you mentioned, because of the video footage. But I'll remind everyone that there's no requirement that those drop boxes be videoed, not since they were first created. And that video footage was leaked, and in fact, I think that the police department was upset that the footage got out. But fortunately it did, and we are the beneficiaries of knowing that set of circumstances occurred, so that we can be having this conversation, which I'm very pleased of, because I was having this conversation several years ago, I think back to the pandemic back in July of 2020 when we came in for a special session on the drop boxes at that time, and I was screaming from the rooftops that this is a bad idea. We're opening up the door for potential fraud. And, I was dismissed more or less out of hand by my colleagues in the majority. And the news media didn't seem particularly interested. And I've been having that same debate over and over again as we've expanded the definition of that's contained in the Constitution about what sickness means to effectively create no excuse absentee voting out of whole cloth. Because, the Constitution, I think, is pretty clear that it is very specific reasons that you would have eligibility for. But nowadays, every political cycle since 2021, you have political candidates sending out absentee ballots to their targeted voters, not caring whether they're actually sick or out of town, because they've effectively, recognized that our laws in the state, coupled with it with an erroneous Supreme Court decision, in my opinion, has expanded us into the realm of absentee voting. I don't mean to get off on a tangent, but I just want to say that that's my concern. My concern is that our absentee voting system in the state is a problem. And I'm disappointed to hear you say that you're satisfied with what is before us as a mechanism to fix it. So let me just ask you a few things specifically. The voter rolls, the generation of the ballot applications that are going out, sent by every political candidate up and down the spectrum in both parties, including the governor of our state, who in the last election not only sent out absentee ballot applications to people, he also sent out a mailing encouraging them to vote by absentee because they are eligible now based on our foray into no excuse absentee voting, through the changes in the way the law is written. Does this any of the legislation that you've asked the committee to bring up address the inconsistencies in our voter rolls, which is the source of those ballot applications?
A few things. I think when I've had discussions about Bridgeport specifically, a lot of people have raised this issue about circulators, right? Right now, it is legal for any entity to sign out more than 5 absentee ballot applications as long as they are on file with the town clerk's office. We've had this conversation, certainly. I believe these things should be out of the hand of political parties, political candidates. I think it unfairly biases people who don't belong to the major parties. But what I am against is a removal of one system without a substitution of another. So I believe that, if political parties aren't doing that, the state has to do it. And I know there's a price tag there, so people haven't been willing to move down that path. But that is actually how many states keep their voter rolls clean. Like, for example, in 2020, I know you were against this when I was on the committee. When the state did send out the absentee ballot applications, guess what? We got a lot of return mail, and it enabled us to update the towns to update the systems. When political parties are the ones doing it, you don't always get all those updates. So many states use that process to keep their rolls as clean as possible. So I think it's a help, not a hazard. And I'm sorry, you asked something else about lists.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman. So the issue really for me was, I asked about what we're doing to fix the voter rolls. I mean, you said a lot of things I'd love to debate you on too, which is what happened in 2020. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of those ballot applications were returned because our voter rolls were in error. And I don't know the extent that the voter rolls were updated or fixed after that. I'll take your word for it that some of it happened, but certainly it's still not fixed. I mean, there are independent groups out there that are right now, and they contact me regularly. They're canvassing, various voters and reviewing voter rolls in every town across Connecticut and discovering, people that are passed on or moved away or in multiple jurisdictions or, the dog is on the voter list. These are problems, that need to be addressed. And my question was not about replacing one system with another one, which is what you implied I was asking for. What I'm asking is, how are we fixing the voter rolls if we're still leaving that as a mechanism for people to use as a way to mail ballot applications?
So fix, I think, is the wrong word. When I worked as a fundraiser for nonprofits, we would always have a mailing list, and we would say, the moment we finalize it, it's obsolete because data happens in real time. People die every day. People move every moment. People get married, divorce. All of these things change the voter rolls. So what is often ignored are one, the legal process by which someone can be added or removed from the voter rolls. Sometimes there's not a distinction made between active and inactive. So if you're inactive, for example, you are still on the voter roll, but if you ever show up to vote, you have to prove certain things, like you were registering for the first time. So sometimes those things are not considered. Every town is also different because we do administer our elections on a town-by-town level about how often they compare death records to the updates. So if you're a town that does it once a month and someone's looking at your list and says, I know so-and-so died 2 weeks ago, it seems inaccurate, but it will be updated. And every town leading right up to an election starts to do it on a daily basis. We also get information, as you know, from the ERIC system, which is still the only system nationwide that allows shared data. So but those updates also come once a year, and all of this is timed in the election calendar to maximize the most complete information closer to the election and the recanvass. That happens, as you know, every town also has to do a recanvass every year where they send a postcard to all their voters. So when those, if any, come back unaddressed, and Kristen, please feel free to chime in if I'm getting any of this wrong, but so when any information comes back as a result of that mailing, that's also when the lists get updated. So fixed is a bit of a misnomer. Like, it is fixed continuously, but there will always be data that is in between some of that timing.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for that answer. I think you kind of made my case for me. It took you several minutes to describe all of the ways that the voter rolls can be inaccurate. You know, the thing is, you know, the reason why we have absentee balloting at all is because, you know, long ago, folks wanted to make sure that we gave an opportunity to people that were not able to show up at the polls in person. They weren't trying to create some whole other system. Oops.
It's just water.
It's just water. We'll send you a bill, Madam Secretary. So,
it's a good thing it's not my coffee.
So, you know, so what has happened in the most, you know, just in the last few years? I mean, this all happened since the pandemic. You know, that we've reached this epic number of mail-in ballot applications and ballots that our system was just never designed for. And we're witnessing the result of that. And Bridgeport is just the most obvious one, but I think there's a lot of other results that we could point to. But the voter rolls are not going to be accurate. You know, for the last 6 or 7 years on this committee, I have put in bills every year to audit election day registration for the exact same reason that you suggested, which is that I want to see what happens when somebody votes by election day registration. They get sent a registration confirmation after. If it's returned in the mail, you know, somebody should do something about that. But we don't, not in Connecticut. And yeah, and I'd love to hear you, you know, tell me I'm wrong on that. I'd be very pleased. But I'm told by the registrars that I know, nothing is done. There's no audit process. They don't have a mechanism in place. You know, like absentee ballot audits, I know that there is some sort of mechanism for that, but I don't know that it goes to truly addressing the problem, which is that our voter rolls really are out of whack. During the pandemic election, I had folks reach out to me letting me know that they received 5, 6 ballot applications for people that lived at the address prior to them. So that's just, you know, some examples of just how out of whack it could be. I listed many of these on the floor of the Senate during our debate, the many letters and calls that I got. The bill does address drop boxes. You know, if it was up to me, we wouldn't have had drop boxes at all. I don't think they serve any legitimate purpose whatsoever. It's an open door for fraud. But they only have one advantage over post office boxes from a voter standpoint, in that they are able to be used, at town hall, effectively right up to the election, with a little less fear of relying on the mail at the last minute. But getting rid of drop boxes isn't really going to solve the Bridgeport problem from my standpoint. And I'd just like to hear your perspective on that, because what quote unquote Wanda, what she did, she could have easily dropped those same ballot applications or ballots into a post office box. She could have actually walked into the town clerk's office and handed them in. I don't know that it would have made any real difference. How does getting rid of drop boxes or deciding that we need to monitor drop boxes right now, which I'm in favor of, don't get me wrong. I'd say, number one, get rid of drop boxes, but if you can't get rid of drop boxes, then we should begin to monitor them. How does this address that problem from your perspective?
Which problem?
The Wanda problem.
Well, as you say, if drop boxes are under surveillance, it gives options, right, to see exactly how they are being used, who's using them. The mailbox does not have that requirement. It also, what I like about drop boxes, they're locked. They're only open during the election period. So, and part of the 5498, I believe, there's also requirements in there. We thought the judge had some good ideas about making sure that town clerks are tracking where the absentee ballot applications or ballots are coming from, a drop box, the mail, in person, etc. I think, I talk to a lot of people, everyday people, who may never come to this hearing room, and I hear stories all the time, and that's what I use to help inform my work. And it may sound like a mailbox, drop box, it's all the same, but people are very specific about how they want to exercise their right to vote. And I've talked to a lot of seniors, for example, who like putting it in the drop box because they know that an election worker is the only person touching that envelope. They feel it's more secure than a mailbox. They feel that they take pride almost. It's like it's the next best thing to going in person, which might be hard for them because, they don't feel great all the time, or they can't walk or stand for a long time, but they get someone to drive them over and they put their drop box in. They put their application or their ballot in the drop box, which is easier than if they might not be able to get out of the house on election day. And some of the stories I've heard are, there are some people on medications where they don't feel, they don't know if they will be well enough to get out of the house on a certain day, and they'll have their caregiver on a good day, because now they have 30, right, to go over and drop off their ballot. So people like having both options.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. Certainly, I would wish things were a lot different. I wish I didn't have to go in person to, renew my driver's license, or, I wish a lot of things, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily good policy to open up the door to mechanisms that might be rife with fraud. And that's the concern I have. And Secretary, you didn't really answer my question. I'm not trying to be hostile to you at all. But I did ask you a pretty direct question, which is, how does this solve the Wanda problem? What are we doing in this bill or in any piece of legislation to actually solve the problem? I know you mentioned a few things around the edges. It amazes me that we were not tracking, where these absentee ballots come from, whether they come from a drop box, post office box, or dropped off at the clerk's office. I can't even believe that actually is not already monitored. So thank God we're going to address that. But the fact of the matter is, I don't see anything changing with the system. We're not going to update the voter rolls. The absentee ballot, harvesters that do that around the state are going to continue their activities. Maybe there'll be a little more scrutiny on them as a result of the attention that's gone on for the last year. But I'm afraid that if the attention goes away, so does the any diminishing of their efforts. And the fact of the matter is, as we mentioned before, every erroneous or faulty or fraudulent ballot is taking away someone else's legitimate vote. So the person that you described, the elderly person that might want to vote by drop box or by mail-in vote, I mean, their vote's going to be canceled out by somebody in a Wanda type situation, and that's what I have as a frustration. People are genuinely frustrated and doubt the validity of our election process. We're going to hear testimony from a lot of people today, and I think that's going to be a theme. People are going to say, I just don't trust the election process anymore. And that's new. I think that's new since 2020. And I certainly won't put that on you. You weren't the Secretary of State at the time. But and I know that you've been trying to manage this situation, which I can't even imagine how difficult it has become given the circumstances. But is there, to my question again, I'll ask it as directly as I can, is there anything in this bill, I get we're gonna monitor drop boxes, okay. To me, I don't know what that means. There's going to be a video camera on it. Who's going to watch all this footage? Is it going to be stored? Is it going to require someone to go back and watch all of it? Or is it just going to be available for someone else to look at? These are questions. But at the end of the day, I don't know that matters. If somebody wanted to put harvested illegitimate ballots into a drop box, if they knew they were monitored, they're just going to put them in a post office box now. I just don't see how that fixes anything. And even monitoring with a camera, I don't think is going to catch somebody. I don't know that anything conclusive has come out of Bridgeport. I don't know that those individuals will ever be charged because of anything that's ultimately conclusive about how many ballots they were putting in the box, et cetera. And all of that is a concern to mine, and it's all part of this new creation, which I don't know has done much to generate the ability for people to be able to vote that they didn't have before. My argument, and I know I've presented to you many times and to this committee, which is that you can leave things as they are. You can have the expansive access to voting that we have, that has been created largely by the majority. I'll give you credit for that. But you got to have something on the other side of the coin, which is an element of security and integrity. And the number one thing I would suggest, which seems to be a non-starter, and I'll pose it to you one more time, in companion to my question is, how does this address the Wanda problem? Wouldn't my idea that we get rid of the unsolicited mailing of ballot applications, period, from anyone, from the Secretary of State's office, from municipalities, from candidates, wouldn't that go a long way? Because what it would do, it would say to that person, the elderly person you were talking about, or anyone else, that if they wanted to vote by absentee, they still can. It's just that they have to take the initial effort of requesting it, which could be done super easy, internet, phone. You could make it happen a lot of different ways, and I'd be willing to even open that up. So what's your response?
Okay, so I'll use your words, the Wanda problem. What would solve it would be adjudication of the charges levied over years. I have no control over the court system. As I think most people know, the same person was named in a case in 2019, which was referred to the courts in June of 2023, and that is still presumably moving through the process. So what would serve, and I assume by the Wanda problem, you mean bad actors who are allegedly interfering with our election system. We have many laws on the books. We have fines, we have jail time, but those cases need to be adjudicated. And there have been bills in this General Assembly this year talking about court process, court timelines, etc. That's outside of my scope. Many of the things that we have suggested would help solve the types of problems we've heard about. I do believe the biggest loopholes are the amount of time that absentee ballot applications are available before an election, and the so-called banking of absentee ballot applications by holding on to them for a long time. So closing those windows, I think, would be very helpful. And again, we have agreed to disagree many times in the past, although, I feel very strongly about protecting the system because it's what I was elected to do. But I have to do so outside of the news headlines, the media glare. I look at the entire process. I speak every day to the people who are on the ground doing this work. I listen to them, I take their suggestions, their recommendations, and I also have to listen to the voters. And I take all of that data and try to walk a fine line between making sure that people have the opportunity to express their right to vote in a way that works for them while closing any potential loopholes that would open it up for broader malfeasance. There are some people who say absentee ballots shouldn't exist at all, and there are also 8 states that conduct their elections entirely by mail, and that is the beauty of the United States of America. And we just have to find the system that works for us. And I think we'll find out what people think with the constitutional amendment on the ballot in November, which is obviously outside the scope of today. But I believe in letting the voters decide and making sure that we are providing opportunities for people who are good actors, which is like 99.8% of our electorate. And something like 441 is aimed at really clamping down on the minority.
Thank you. I'm just going to interject very briefly. I just wanted to make sure, keep us on track with how we're talking about things. And generally, we don't make reference to specific individuals or allegations in our hearings. And so I would just caution everyone, both in terms of our rules, but also just in terms of the kind of the quality of the conversation and the precision. It would be best if we are referring to any problems or solutions, that we refer to those problems in terms of what the actual specific problems are, not in relation to any person or their name. Thank you. And Senator, please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I was using the term simply for the edification of people watching who would know exactly what I was talking about by doing so. I appreciate the feedback, Madam Secretary. I mean, you started by talking about adjudication, and I'm with you. I mean, I've listed all the convicted folks over the years based on absentee ballot fraud, and there's a rather lengthy list that you can go through from numerous communities, not just Bridgeport, around the state, going back several decades, and I've pointed those out on the floor because many times, when you start talking about election fraud, people on the left tend to say that you're making it up, you're exaggerating, et cetera, and I don't think I'm exaggerating. I think I've been very forthright about pointing to legitimate occurrences, and the Bridgeport issue is definitely one of those. And I appreciate the bill that's before us. I mean, I do have concerns about a couple of sections of that bill, but overall, I do support the ideas that are in there. I just don't think it goes anywhere far enough, and I don't think it addresses the problem that we have been discussing. I especially like the loopholes that are being addressed, those timelines that you mentioned, and the banking issue that you described. But those things I think, are going to continue, maybe not on a significant a level, because the fact of the matter is what's happening here is that by virtue of having either the state or municipalities or individual candidates mailing out ballot applications to people on the voter rolls, people that don't legitimately deserve to receive them are going to. That's just a fact. People are going to receive them for prior residence of addresses, for their kids that have moved away to college. And the sad reality is some people are going to fill them out. This is the reality. Not everybody, might be a very small percentage of people, but some people are going to fill them out for their parents. Some of them are going to fill them out for their kids away at school. Some of them are going to fill them out for their elderly, relatives. It's going to happen. I think it has happened. And elections are decided by small margins. In the town of Southington, in the last state cycle, we had an election decided by one vote. And an enormous number of absentee ballots were cast in that election as well. I also, would just remind everyone of some of the frailties of absentee voting, which is that a significant number of votes are thrown away at the end of the day. That doesn't necessarily happen with in-person voting because people don't follow the proper protocol about putting more than one ballot in an envelope, and votes that were dropped off in drop boxes and post office boxes after the election had already gone by. There was a huge dust up in this committee 2 years ago because I made a big deal about a drop box that had a bunch of ballots stuffed in the door of it. And, the SEC investigated, and they came back, and they were so pleased to tell me, Senator, no, that was perfectly legitimate. There was nothing wrong with that, except for the fact that those people thought they were having their votes counted, but their votes didn't count. There's nothing to celebrate. So I think what we've done is we've taken what used to be our in-person voting system that makes allowances for the fact that some people can't vote in person by creating a program that allows those people to vote by mail through our absentee system, and we've turned it on its head. And now we are trying to expand mail-in voting when we don't have protections. You mentioned 8 other states that have mail-in voting as a regular means of voting. Those states also design their whole system with that in mind. When they register someone to vote, they take legitimate data. I don't know, maybe some of them even take a fingerprint, for crying out loud. But they take some way to verify someone's identity, and then they track it, and they keep those voter rolls secure. And then when you actually submit your ballot, you have an identification number or a signature verification process, or you've got to enclose a copy of your photo identification. We don't have any of those things. So what I see is a wide open door for people, you call them bad actors, and that's indeed what they are. I just think there's way more of them than just 1 or 2 people in Bridgeport. And I think every time you have a Bridgeport redo, we find out just how extensive this problem is. But I think it's happening all over. Maybe not in, tens of thousands of votes, but it wouldn't take much. As I won my first election by 46 votes. Again, the election that was decided last year, it happens every cycle. There are elections decided by a handful of votes. And who knows just how many of those are being impacted by this. I mean, I share every concern you have about disenfranchising voters. The fact of the matter is that I think having a system that cannot be relied on is the biggest potential for disenfranchisement. There are a bunch of things that we could certainly talk about. There is nothing in this bill about photo ID for in-person or for absentee voting. Getting recording the drop boxes doesn't, in my mind, solve a problem, which is people filling out ballots that don't belong to them and then delivering them to either a drop box, a post office box, or in person. And the easy solution is the unsolicited mailing ban that I've discussed, which you didn't really address, but I take it that you're not in favor of getting rid of it.
I just don't think that would solve the problem that you described before for the reason that I described before, which is in some of these instances, bad actors co-opted valid votes, right? From the voter perspective, they did everything right. They just didn't know. I do think public education would be one of the second most powerful things to solve a lot of these issues, because most people, especially if you move here from another state where things operate differently, or you don't follow the GAE committee in the legislature, you're not intimately associated with Title IX, what is or isn't legal. And I could easily imagine if I went to one of my neighbors' homes who was elderly and said, hey, I'm going by town hall, can I drop off your AB? They would say, oh, that'd be great, thank you, honey. And they wouldn't think anything was wrong with that. So getting information into the hands of voters across many different election-related issues, I think is of huge importance.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that. I don't disagree, except that I don't think that that's the problem. Certainly those people intended to vote, and their vote would end up there either way. I'm more concerned about people that are acting maliciously and for the purpose of disrupting our election process and us creating a system that allows it to happen instead of focusing on security. But I suppose we could beat that horse all day, Madam Secretary.
Can I give you an example, if you don't mind? No, I think of it as counterfeiters, right? Like there are people who counterfeit U.S. currency, and it was a big problem. I remember my first job at the local ice cream shop. There were news stories all the time about all these counterfeit $20 bills. And what the U.S. government ended up doing was getting more information into the hands of little shop owners like my boss, making sure we understood, hold it up, look for the threads. This was knowledge that was not generally available, but we learned that there's no way for the U.S. Treasury to police every single $20 bill, and that you had to rely on the people understanding what a counterfeit bill looked like so that you could stop it close to the root. If a town saw a proliferation of counterfeit bills, the feds knew where to attack. We have to empower people to understand and act on malfeasance when they see it. We can't be the only ones to reach out and try to block every bad actor. So the same lady who told our election monitor, I gave it to the nice lady to drop off, if she knew that weren't allowed, we might have gotten a very different call. She might have called and said, someone tried to take my ballot, and that would allow us to get to the root of the problem. So I think we have to also empower and educate people to help us root out problems where they do exist.
Through Mr. Chairman, thank you, Madam Secretary. I appreciate your example, except that I would put it that, the government improved the money. They decided to change the way they print bills. They put different types of security protection measures in the money. They improved their security to combat the problem.
And there are still counterfeiters.
There is, but I think it's a lot harder to counterfeit a bill today than it was, 20 years ago. And the sad fact is that in the last 3 years, it is way easier to cheat in a Connecticut election than it was before. That is why we're here. That is why I'm asking you these questions, because this bill doesn't go nearly far enough. It doesn't even scratch the surface in addressing what went on in Bridgeport and is happening at some level across Connecticut. And there are going to continue to be problems. And I'm going to say it on the record right here. Watch. You know, I told people in 2020 on the floor of the Senate, I said, watch. And I'm saying it again today, watch. We're not addressing the problem. And sadly, I think it's because a lot of people like the system the way it is. And that's unfortunate. I want to see people have the most access to voting possible without interfering with anyone else's, the validity of their votes. And that concerns me. Madam Secretary, I'll just wrap it up. You know, I hope that we can continue on the things that we do agree on, and I do appreciate that you've brought some things to the committee that we will no doubt act on that will help the system. I just, as I said, I don't think it goes anywhere near far enough. And I know there's a lot of other topics that we should definitely talk about, and maybe this is not the time and place, but I would just think, you know, with early voting, you know, coming into play, I mean, I think that ought to be enough of a mechanism to kind of scale back the pressure on more mail-in voting, because I think that the in-person voting actually solves a lot of the concerns over, you know, giving people access without the potential for so much you know, wrongdoing and bad actors being involved. I appreciate your time today, Madam Secretary, and that's all my questions, Mr. Chairman. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator.